Hey guys, it's Bill from Linden, Tennessee. So, I am back on the Jeep again. And this has been pretty tough. A lot of stuff's gone wrong all in one shot, and it can wear on you. And there for a little while, I was thinking I was just going to put this thing up on some rollers, slide it over to the side of the garage, and move to the next thing for a little while, give it a rest. But I'm not going to do that just yet. Um, so the springs aren't quite right, and I've been talking back and forth with custom coils custom coil services, really good guys. Was talking to Kevin, really nice guy, very helpful. He talked to his engineers. We're trying to figure out the cause of this problem. So here's all the so this is the original rear spring. This is the 2-inch lift or 3-inch lift spring that I had from Iron Rock suspension, and these are the front ones. But so what happened was these 3-inch lift springs, by the time they sagged down under the weight of all the batteries, ended up being the same ride height as the 2-inch lift springs that I got from CCS. Despite the fact they have a 500-pound heavier rating, load capacity, the math doesn't really work out, but the result is, well, there it is. CCS, I mean, they're not going to do anything for me for the springs that they custom made for me. I mean, they don't want them. Who would want them? So, but they did. We kind of talked back and forth and figured out one thing we could do is just keep the load rating the same, but then just put a 3 or maybe a 4-inch lift on those springs, and then that would pull the back end of this thing up. But I didn't really care for that too much, so I went back here and I lifted up the back of this thing and brought it up another 2 inches. And if you lift this up another 2 inches, it just kind of looks silly with these 31-inch tires. So I'm not going to do that, not just yet. What I'm probably going to do is just get different shocks, and then that'll allow me more up travel on the suspension, which is really all I'm shooting for anyway. So. And then also, I don't have all the weight in this thing yet. The drive unit's not in the front battery box, obviously. So I don't know. Maybe with all the weight in, these heavier springs will stay where they are. They won't sag anymore, although that's unlikely to. Anyway, so just gonna marinate on that for a little while, get some movement. What I have been up to is my steering system. So I had told you that I was gonna put a Prius power steering assist gearbox in there, and there it is. So I took out the hydraulic pump, the MR2 power steering pump, took that sucker out of there, made a hellacious mess, and I bought another intermediate steering drive shaft for a Jeep Wrangler. I bought that on eBay, and I kind of hacked and chopped that thing up to where I think it needs to be. I've got an intermediate drive shaft for a Prius coming too. That way I get the U-joint that goes on the bottom of this steering gear. It's obviously got the correct splines on it, and that needs to weld to the Jeep U-joint, and hopefully I can move things around, shift stuff around, and give myself enough room. Well, I'm going to have to move stuff around, shift stuff around, give me enough room so that there's some slip in that connection. That way I can service this thing. I can take that out if I have to, or whatever. I don't think I'd ever have to, because really, what could go wrong with a electric power steering pump, or electric power steering? It's not even a pump. It's just an electric motor that either goes forward or backwards and turns on a ring worm gear, and just gives you some assist. So, what could go wrong? But I got to have some serviceability for it anyway. I got to be able to get the thing out and in. I got to be able to get it in there. So, anywho, that's what I'm working on now. Still waiting on that drive shaft to come back. And also, since I was sitting here and the DC-DC was sitting there, I went ahead and took the sucker apart to try and figure out what's wrong with it. And if you look right about there, oh, blammo. Pow, that sucker blew out right there. Why? Why did it do that? What is that? I don't have any idea. My SteathEV charger, DC-DC converter, it failed. It stopped working too, but it was a different failure. Completely different failure. So, I don't know. both SteathEV and actually OVAR Technologies, they all, of course, they were, you know, questioning me and the wiring that I did of this thing. But I mean, this is basic wiring, man. You got that big red cable that comes out, it goes into a fuse, and then it goes to the battery. That's it. There's no wiring to do. And you got, you know, high voltage coming from the pack, from the distribution box in there. There's nothing you can get wrong. The SteathEV, it's likely what happened because I had a contactor on the negative side, and you're not supposed to have a contactor on the negative side, I guess, because somewhere in this DC-DC, it's got a whole bunch of capacitors there. All these dudes right there, all those capacitors, they have to get charged, and similar to charging the capacitors in an inverter, you got to have some sort of a pre-charge circuit. So there's probably a relay in here with a pre-charge circuit for all those capacitors. And as soon as it gets the signal, the 12 volt on signal, it does that pre-charge and charge those capacitors. But what was happening maybe is that when I was turning the key on, the DC-DC was going through that process, charging those capacitors, and then the BMS at the same time was going through its check, and then it would turn on the negative contactor. So the negative contactor would close, sending 400 volts into this DC-DC converter after the DC-DC converter had done its own pre-charge. I mean, that makes sense. That makes sense that could have been what happened. So that's why my DC-DC, or my contactor, welded shut, because it was opening and closing under a really high load, charging up those capacitors. And it's ultimately why this thing, the Stealth one, failed, because those capacitors were just opening and closing, or charging too fast. So that's why you have a pre-charge circuit, to avoid that from happening. So I've since gotten rid of the negative contactor. I've never had one in any other build. Everybody says, "Oh, it's a safety thing. It's a safety thing," and that's fine, but it doesn't actually, control any current. It would open, in case of something happens, but so would the positive contactor. And if, for some reason, maybe the negative contactor that you installed was faulty, and it just for whatever reason, welded itself shut, or maybe it was welded shut from the factory. You don't know. How would you know if the negative contactor was wrong, if it was bad? If you've got a positive contactor that's essentially killing your high voltage circuit, and your negative contactor is just sort of a backup to that. But if the backup was faulty, you'd never have a way of knowing. Anyway, I'm rambling now, sorry. That's just me trying to convince myself that I didn't do anything wrong. So, no, I did. That probably was wrong. Now, it would have been really, really, really nice if the wiring diagram that accompanied the SteathEV DCDC had a note on there saying, "Do not use a negative contactor in this circuit. Do not run that through a negative contactor directly. Run it directly to the negative high voltage battery." But it didn't, and there we are. So yeah, still trying to get that DC-DC converter back, or I guess now you wouldn't call it that. You'd call it a charger, because that's all it is right now, charger. So I'm going to work with OVAR and see if they can come up with some reason why that would have failed. Fixing that, I suspect, would mean replacing that whole circuit board that's in the back. And to replace that whole circuit board that's in the back, you have to take everything out of here. It'd be a horror. It'd be just an absolute horror. And it's just not, I don't think it's worth it. I'm just going to put an external DC-DC controller somewhere. I don't know where just yet, but I'm going to do that, and that'll be better. So anyway, that'll be better. So yeah, so that's where I'm at. So I'm going to get that done. Once I've got that installed and it works, then I've got a few other things I need to reroute my coolant lines on the bottom there. I'm going to run these two in series, and they will service the cooling for the controller. I'm sorry, for the motor. Both of those will be the cooling for the motor. There's no sense of just using one. I know it'll need two. So if it turns out that I need cooling for the batteries, then I can just put a little radiator with a fan on it somewhere else, and that'll be fine. I'm also going to put a second water pump towards the back to feed coolant into the rear batteries because it wasn't working very well. So those are kind of easy things. The interior, of course, still needs work on. I can do that too. In fact, I've got a little list, as always. Make a list. I don't know what I did with my list, so that's not very helpful, is it? Anyway, all right. So that's where we're at. That's what I've been up to. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you again.